Well, I think I was part of that group, but I looked up some stuff on damage to the frontal lobe, and it'll mess up with your ability to remember stuff, so plays would be a problem. Messes with a little bit of their motor function as well. Let's see what else. Oh, yeah, so impaired judgment, so they wouldn't be able to make as good of calls in games.
Yeah, and then also in the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It's basically all their cognitive skills.
It's a big component. So, you know, the regulation. So one thing that we didn't touch on very much, but I do want you guys to understand, is in your frontal lobe, there's a structure called the prefrontal cortex. And this effectively is the thing that helps you make good decisions. And what's fascinating is, statistically speaking, it literally matures in women about 2 years chronologically before it matures in men. And this is why quite frequently you hear the complaint from women that guys their age are immature. And it's actually true, because literally that structure of the brain isn't fully formed. And so if you have an injury to that structure, you're going to make less than optimal decisions. So aka not just like, oh, maybe I forgot to, you know, make the right decision on the sports ball game, but more like, oh, I didn't keep myself calm. I didn't control my emotions there. I didn't control my impulses there, which is going to be problematic. I mean, for example, you know, myself, I went over to Costco on Saturday, and, you know, I hike over there from my house and load up everything in a backpack and hike it back. And while I was going through it, there was only one person not wearing a mask in the entire store. One dude wearing a hat where he was obviously, he paid money for a hat that is supporting a specific individual for president. And I'm not going to fill in the name there because you can probably guess. And he's the only individual not wearing a hat. Now, I live in a society. I wanted to say something, but I decided anything I say is probably going to be a little too aggressive, and it's not going to really help add to the conversation. But what I wanted to do was yell at them and call them a snowflake and tell them to put a mask on, or we're going to have issues. Now, is that actually making the world a better place? Go ahead and pull that, guys. I really want to know your thoughts on this one. Oh, dear God, Tyler. I don't think that's really making the world a better place by just screaming at people in public, irregardless if you feel you're correct. Just because, you know, we live in a society, and it turns out the way that I'm built and the way that I look, anytime I yell at a person, it's going to probably seem a lot more threatening than if, you know, I was much smaller and otherwise. So hence, I kept that to myself. Now, if I had an injury to my prefrontal cortex and otherwise, I might have gone off and done that yelling at someone. And how many of you guys have seen someone, or who am I kidding? Think about your own life. How many of you guys have done something, said something to someone or otherwise that you're like, oh, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that. And part of that is, in theory, is the prefrontal cortex firing like it should be. Now, one of the problems is underneath that is our limbic system. And that's going to be that fight or flight and otherwise, which that's still technically a front structure because our skull's there. And there's a chance that you mess up your amygdalas, mess up your hippocampus, and then have dysregulation of your memory. You can have damage to your hypothalamus, which is going to throw off your pituitary gland and all your hormone production. So there's a lot of issues you can have from taking an injury to those parts of the brain. Now, when it comes to the left side and the right side of the skull, you guys should be relatively similar in some ways, but different in others. What did you guys come up with?
For the left side, it it affects the right side of the body and gives it weakness, and affects the communication skills along with listening and reading. And it also said that it gives problems with logic such as math and science.
Great job. And so what's the key difference then when we look at the other side of the brain?
It would be similar to the right side, except for the body movements, because the right side controls the left sided body movements.
That's good. So obviously we're going to have some asymmetry of movements. We're also going to see on the left side of the brain is also where you have the speech center. We're talking about Broca's area and Wernicke's, which is going to be other locations that are going to throw off issues with speech. Yes, you're going to have issues with maybe not just hearing, but then that's where you talk about that sensitivity to sound and otherwise, because effectively your ears are no longer calibrated like they once were to the amount of volume and noise that you would encounter. So nice job, guys. Now, if we're talking about the back of the head, what can be some issues there?
So we have the occipital lobe, including like the cerebellum and cerebrum, and it has a lot to do with your sight. So it can mess up your sight a lot. You can have the inability to see colors. You have coordination problems because of the cerebellum, difficult to see multiple objects at once, inability to recognize words, fine motor skills. A lot of those will be messed up. And it could also include neck problems, considering it's connected to your spinal cord and everything back there. Hallucinations, dizziness, difficulties with reading and writing because of the occipital lobe.
Great job. Exactly. You can have a lot of different tissues and systems that have some major dysregulation with just taking exactly some type of damage to the back of the brain. And not just as in what you see, but also a certain amount of your occipital lobe is important in visualization. So you can try to, visualize something and think your way through it. That can also be incredibly challenged. And so one of the issues that I have what's known as post-concussive syndrome. Suffered a major concussion a number of years ago, and it still gives me issues to this day, which is showing some wonderful flaws in the medical environment. The good news or bad news for you guys is it turns out the hippocampus and most of my frontal lobe is 100% on board. But I still have issues with the limbic system and just a couple other random things going on because it turns out the brain is a giant and very complex organ. But one thing is my eyes don't work very well together. So what that literally means, if you think of your eyes as effectively two laser pointers that are trying to always hit the same point whenever you're staring at something, my right eye tends to not keep up with my left. So when I move and look over at something quickly, I'll see double for a second, and then my right eye will get to where it needs to be. And then I'll look, and then it'll catch up to where it needs to be. And if I really try to stare at something hard, my left eye can hold it pretty well, but my right eye will start to drift a little bit. And so when I stare at certain objects, and it's really weird, certain patterns, they shake. So it looks like things are vibrating for me. I don't think that's what happens to most other humans, and it didn't happen to me before. One of obviously the more recent concussions. It turns out I've had a number of them thanks to collegiate cheerleading and otherwise. Okay, good. When we talk about damage to concussions to or more severe damage to the brain, now you're absolutely correct. There can be complete tissue necrosis. So that's where you're talking about doing enough injury to those tissues that literally they're dead and they're gone. That is a possibility. There can be issues with damage where you have effectively not as effective perfusion, meaning blood flow to those structures of the brain as you did previously. And that's where you can have issues with fatiguing out rapidly or just not able to keep up those outputs. And that's more of where I fall because they've actually done an MRI on my head. It turns out the brain's still there and everything's working like it should. But the problem with an MRI is it's the equivalent of popping the hood on your car and then looking in there and be like, there's an engine in there. We're not actually testing to see how the engine's firing. Is the engine, running like it's supposed to? Is it knocking? And all the other types of issues you can have mechanically. It's just more like, yep, all the pieces of the engine are here, so I don't know what you're complaining about, which is, well, obviously when I make that argument right there, it's pretty safe to say we found the flaws. You can do what's known as a SPECT scan, but it's more expensive, and it's just hard to get access to because they're far more rare, which single proton emission computer topography, where literally what they do is they look at the blood flow in all of the structures of the brain to make sure that effectively all the structures in your brain are getting the adequate and appropriate amount of blood flow to those regions. And so that's one of those that's probably going to be more useful diagnostically for concussion care. But to be fair, we're talking about an organ that we do not fully understand how the brain works. And it's important to understand that science is moving in the direction where it needs to. And it just takes time. And doing research on the brain, I don't want to give a biopsy of my brain tissue, much less would I think that any of you guys should. And the brain is plastic, meaning it changes with time, specifically based upon the inputs you're putting into it. That's what learning is based on, which is literally changing the structure of the brain and learning, be it obviously intellectual skills, physical skills, social skills. All of those require time, repetition, and then the period of time needed to recover. So it's important to treat the brain like you treat your muscles, like you treat the rest of your body, hopefully, which is you do apply a stimulus to try and get better at things, and you give it time to recover from that stimulus. And then understanding, just the basics of if you overtax it, you can have issues. If you abuse it, you can have issues. And the weird thing about the brain is, just like the body, it's constantly taking and adapting to the demands placed upon it. So if all you're ever doing is staring at a little computer screen and spinning the wheel, finding a way to make yourself less happy going through social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc., you're just training your brain to be essentially a gerbil on the wheel, consuming more on a never-ending cycle of information that's not really helping your life too much, which is a weird thing to think about, but it's important to be deliberate, because your brain is really only able to react to all the information that it's able to bring in. So it's important to choose what information you are bringing in. And that is another interesting kind of philosophical conversation outside of the realm of this class. Now, we talked about the hippocampus and how that's important for memory. Now, the amygdala is the fear center of the brain, and that is a really fascinating structure. They're essentially like two almond-sized pieces that are going to be effectively kind of back a little bit on either side of the hippocampus, deep inside of your brain. Now, this is literally your threat detection and your natural, fear, concern response. So does anybody, if you have a phobia here, go ahead and throw that up in the chat, because that's a great example of your amygdala, firing whenever it sees something that freaks it out, that legitimately concerns it. And then some of them are obviously a little overblown on occasion, meaning that what you're afraid of is really not something to be afraid of. And then others, they're very well meaning fears. So really, nobody's afraid of spiders, snakes, heights, and afraid of being in smaller spaces. That's claustrophobia is completely normal. That's something to have, legitimate concern about, because it turns out we're not exactly meant to live in very small holes. We're meant to be able to find our way, yes, you can go live in a cave or otherwise, but really tight spaces aren't exactly something that could be a good thing to be around, because that also means it's much harder to escape. Yeah, turns out you can obviously perish from falling from too high, and good old danger noodles, as I like to call them, and spiders can quite possibly be things that literally one bite kills you. So it's natural to be afraid of those things, and there's nothing wrong with, for having a fear of one thing or another. Some folks, are agoraphobic. They're afraid to even go outside. There's some folks that are afraid of, things that you wouldn't even suspect most folks would be afraid of. And the reason I can't give a lot of things there, because not that I'm completely a man without fear, but more along the lines of, it's just things that you wouldn't even think of. Some folks are afraid of the feelings of certain fabrics. Yeah, I'd say death is probably something to be afraid of. Well, not really. I mean, to be fair, we don't really exist that long. And I mean, why are you afraid of death? Do you remember what it felt like before you were born? It's probably going to feel the exact same after you're alive. So if you don't remember how that feels, can't be that bad, right?
I think it's more just like you completely stop existing after, and everybody forgets about you. And no one really knows what happens after.
Exactly. So it's existentialism at its best. You should probably look up, Sartre's work and Camus. Camus is awesome. Camus. But once again, now we're going to philosophy. Now, here's the thing that's really cool is it's very rare, but some folks literally have a calcified amygdala. It doesn't work. So they literally have no threat and fear detection. Now, go ahead in the poll, guys. Do you guys think that would be fun thing to have, or do you think that would probably not be a great thing to have? And you guys are absolutely correct. It turns out not having any threat detection is horrible. One of the documented cases, and it's really interesting. Now it's with fear, fear, concern. It's like I said, it's threat detection. So like, you know, for me, this is my peak week for lifting. So today I'm going to be doing a heavy set of squatting. And before I do that heavy set of squatting, like I'm going to be a little, you know, a little nervous, a little amped up, you know, trying to make sure that I have my quote unquote mind right, because it turns out if I screw up, the load is, I mean, not that I think any of you guys care, it's going to be 425 for a set of 5 on an 8-second eccentric for each rep. So it's going to be absolutely freaking miserable. But you know, that's what I got slated. So I'm going to hit it and, you know, live. But if I just walked in like, oh, da, 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 like, and just be nonchalant and not really focused, that's literally where that weight could cripple me. Like it could do damage to my body in ways that would make it so I would have to crawl to my phone to then call for medical attention if I even get there. So it should be something that makes me nervous. So, you know, Tyler, the same thing before you throw a standing backflip. Yeah, you want to have at least a good, healthy thought of like, if I don't throw this well, I could naturally select myself by landing on my head. So we want to have a certain amount of threat detection because it's just going to help us focus. Now, it's the key is when it becomes too much, when it's that phobia, when it becomes panic, when it becomes, you know, the straight up running away, we're not able to focus anymore. That's when obviously your fear response is too great. And well, too great for us to manage. Now, don't get me wrong, if all of a sudden, you know, I look outside and there's freaking Cthulhu, I do want to run as fast as I can the other way and probably try not to go insane. And if you guys catch what that's a reference to, go ahead and write the author's name in the chat. And if you do so, I'll respect the fact that you are also into horror like I am. But one of the really interesting interviews I listened to was a woman that actually doesn't have a functioning amygdala. And she's a super nice lady, kind of older now, you know, married, had kids and everything else. But literally, this woman has been held at gunpoint twice in her life because literally one of them, she recounts the story of, yeah, so I was getting gas at like 2:00 in the morning in the inner city. And, you know, she's, you know, some cities, she's not from around the area. And these guys yelled at her to come over into this alleyway. And so she's like, okay, and then walked over there and, you know, then they tried to help hold her up. Now, it turns out most of us, if you were getting, you know, gas at 2:00 in the morning in an area where you're unfamiliar and two guys that you've never met before in your life are yelling for you to come into an alleyway, are you going to take up that offer? Are you going to sign off on that? There's going to be that little bit in your head going like, nah, man, I'm good. Like, if you guys need me to call for somebody to help you, like, yeah, I'll do that. But I'm not walking away from my car, especially when I don't know what's going on. And that's the key issue with this lady is she doesn't have that. She doesn't have that little like, that might not be a smart decision. Or, I mean, heck, how many of you guys have got friends or you were that person when you were younger that you were, weren't really good at assessing fears and otherwise, and maybe jumped off of objects that were a little higher than what your bones could tolerate? Or, you know, I think a good example of this is, you know, most times before someone nearly gets a Darwin Award, when they start off by saying, hey, everybody, watch this. I apologize for using that accent. I don't know why that came up, but that was the thing. So we want to have that fear center working. And obviously in some folks it doesn't. And then other folks, it's too hyperactive. Any questions over the kind of the structures of the brain, why they matter, and how they're all going to go ahead and work? I should have figured that, Tyler, you were that guy that has done some things that were less than safe.
I actually had a question.
Yeah, go for it, bud.
So would that be like the same thing with, like, say, like a mental block? Like, we have a girl on the team, like, not naming names, but she won't do any type of running, tumbling, but she tried out with a running full. So like she has really nice tumbling, but she literally won't do a tuck now. But it's just because she says she has a mental block over it.
It's, part of it is, that's a really fascinating thing, because that might not necessarily be the amygdala. So the brain's weird, and then we have this thing called the default mode network, and that's the chatter, like the stuff that's just going in the background of your brain all the time, and that's going to be a little bit lower in your still cerebrum. Right now, guys, if you guys were to literally type in the chat, like what's going through your head, it's probably like a little bit of stuff to do with this class. Then it's like, I need to go pick up groceries later today. I need to do laundry. I need to work out. I wonder what's new on insert the social media, thinking about the person or people you're dating. Lord knows if people you're dating, that's probably taking up a lot of your mental bandwidth. And so folks can get themselves into loops where they're effectively just keep telling themselves the same thing over and over, and they can effectively get stuck. I mean, they call it the yips in, I believe it's golf, where an athlete like effectively forgets how to swing their club, even though they're super high skilled, because they get in their own way. The problem with a lot of, thank you, Zach, baseball, I appreciate it, where you're going to see a lot of folks get in their own way because they're too busy thinking about what they need to do and not letting their body do it. Because the part of your brain that's effectively, giving you the narration of, talking you through what you're doing in your life, which is hopefully giving you more positive self-talk than negative self-talk, isn't the part that's really doing the work. It's just the one that's talking about it. So it's important in my mind, and especially when working with athletes, that you do your best to facilitate their own ability to do the work without essentially having too much mental chatter, of focusing too much. So, and I know Tyler is part of the cheerleading team. I used to help out some with the squad. Hopefully I will again at some point, who knows, the joys of living in a pandemic world, where, the goal is not to give an athlete like 80 different things to think about. Just give them one or two simple things to think about and make those essential cues as simple as possible so that they're not having to spend all this mental bandwidth and thinking about every single part of a routine, every single part of a stunt, just focusing on maybe one outcome at a time and kind of let them move forward with their skill from there. So does that kind of answer your question, Tyler?
Yeah.
So, the whole buck up and put on your, big girl pants thing, that's not a really good methodology. It is for some folks. Another thing, and this is kind of getting more into the neurology, is keep in mind that we all have our own perspectives. We all walk through this world in our bodies and observe the things we observe, and that gives us, our worldview and gives us our perspective, what we think of other people, what we think of other people, or what we think other people think of us, and so on and so forth. So I think of myself as very normal. I don't think of myself as strange or really different. I think of myself as a normal person. I see a lot of other people that I think are strange because their life is very different than mine. The way they conduct themselves is very different than how I do it, how I live my life, and so on and so forth. Because I'm living, obviously, in my one point of view and my one perspective. So, and really think this through, guys. This is not meant to be a throwaway, and we'll get to your question in a second, Catherine. But do you think that really attractive people, when they're walking through the world, think that most people in the world are nicer than what an average person thinks? And you think someone that's honestly very unattractive, or, has, I don't know, some type of mark or scar otherwise that people would consider disgusting, would think that most people they encounter are mean or unkind because of the looks that they receive from those individuals? So now that's, like I said, it's a kind of a thought experiment that's not necessarily 100% the truth, but it is important to understand that your perspective is your perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the methods that have worked for you, that have allowed you to be successful, that have also been the same things that have caused the failures that you've had in your life, which hopefully you've had both, success and failure. well, obviously it's at least some success because you're here. Those is what works in the past, might not be what works in the future. And then just because that's what worked for you, might not be what works for everybody else. So that's an important thing, because we all have yes, we have all these structures in common, but how these have been tuned, the natural abilities of some of these tissues compared of one person to another, when we get to different things like types of intelligence, it's just very important to have a respect for the fact that we're all different, and that it's not so much about you need to tell people how to do things because that's how you did them. You need to find a way to tell people these things that allows them to understand what you're saying. How can I answer your question, Catherine?
So what about, like, I think it's called aphantasia, where people can visualize things in their brain and have like that inner voice, but not everybody has that.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what part of the brain is that? Like, is that a normal thing to have it, or do a lot of people not have that?
Now that's a great question, because I'm a muscle physiologist when it comes to exercise physiology. So really getting outside of the the wheelhouse. And B, when it comes to there's also, have you heard of synesthesia, where people have essentially a carryover from one sense to another? They can literally see sounds and taste colors and things along those lines. Like, there's a lot of very interesting, modifications, maybe the best way to say it, of how different structures in the brain are going to work. Some folks, they literally have an issue with visualizing anything in their head. So it would be what referred to as like spatial intelligence. So if somebody shows you a picture of something and they say, rotate it this many degrees, what should it look like? And, some folks just don't have, or they have very low abilities to do so, and others have really high abilities to do so. And that's one of those things that, comes down to, probably genetics to a certain extent. But as far as, all of the causative factors for it, if we still have no good, consistent cures for a number of different mental illnesses, and placebos work nearly as effectively as the actual drugs in a number of cases, it's safe to say we don't fully understand how all that works. So, sorry I don't have a better answer for you. Any other questions, guys? No? All right, so now that we're done with the neurological side of it, make sure you guys remember about, obviously, our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So we're talking fight or flight. We're going to make sure you guys remember the ways that we can send a signal faster by myelination, increasing the size, understanding what a Golgi tendon organ is, what a muscle spindle is, what a kinesthetic receptor is, and then how we need to be able to manage and understand our afferents and efferents when it comes to information coming in and going out. Obviously, we got all the systems and all the structures in the central nervous system that does all that processing. So now let's go ahead and talk about some hormones. So chapter 4 is all about endocrinology, and endocrinology to me is one of the most interesting things when it comes to exercise physiology and just physiology in general. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the basics of just what class of hormones we have, how receptors are going to be specific to the hormone and specific in the cell, which will then give you those actions. Then the basics of those endocrine glands that we have and the hormones they produce, how we're going to regulate this during exercise, and then how hormones are also going to play, obviously, a role in chronic adaptations to training. So without further ado, your endocrine system is just another communication system in the body. Now, the key is it lasts far longer, but it responds far slower than our nervous system. Our nervous system is immediately trying to go ahead and adapt to a situation. Whereas our endocrine system, it takes a little while. I had lunch at about 12:45. So, if within probably 10 to maybe 20 odd minutes of that meal, my body was releasing more insulin to help keep my blood sugar from going too high from the carbohydrates in the meal. And so we're doing this because we're trying to maintain homeostasis. We're trying to keep these values within certain ranges. I bring up carbohydrates because now we're talking about insulin to bring it down, glucagon to increase it, and how blood sugar is really, really important. Specifically, if we go too high, we can have issues with glycosylation of structures, which can lead to things like neuropathy, gangrene, death, aka essentially uncontrolled diabetes type 1 or type 2. The mechanism of those two do differ, which we will touch on. And then understanding the reality of too low blood sugar will also lead to death. So hypoglycemia, dizziness, fainting, feeling lightheaded, to obviously straight up, unfortunately, passing away. So our body is trying to tightly regulate a number of different, not just values, but hormones in our body, because they're really important for overall wellness and health. So this is going to be coordinated thanks to what's going to come down to typically the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which is going to cause the increase and decrease of certain hormone production when we're exercising. And then we're going to have other things that signal, like erythropoietin from the kidneys, which is going to be released thanks to having too low of oxygen content going to them, which is typically an occurrence when you do, moderate to high intensity aerobic exercise, which is good because it leads to an increased red blood cells, which is a positive adaptation to long distance training. So once again, this is there to keep us where we need to be. And we're going to talk about aldosterone, angiotensin, and ACE effectively. Also parathyroid hormone has much more calcium, and more ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which is going to be important for fluid regulation. So our three major classes of hormones are steroids, peptides, and then effectively individual amino acid. Steroid hormones are simply going to be derived from the base of cholesterol. Does not mean that a steroid is causing you to gain muscle mass or otherwise. In fact, a lot of steroids, corticosteroids specifically, when you talk about things like prednisone, are really good at getting you to lose muscle mass and become more or less insulin sensitive. So it's not a good thing. Now, what's fascinating is since our steroid hormones are fat soluble, they're effectively derived from cholesterol, which is in the classification of fats, they will actually go through cellular membranes and then bind to a secondary messenger inside of the cell, or literally bind directly to a receptor inside of the nucleus, which is going to cause DNA translation into transcription, and then give us the extra proteins that we need for whatever we're trying to accomplish inside of our cell. So our adrenal glands are giving us cortisol and aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to be important for fluid regulation. Cortisol is that major stress hormone, which is going to help free up carbohydrates and fats for fuel. It's also going to help us catabolize our own muscles, so we don't want too much of that. Our ovaries and testes are going to be producing the sex-specific androgens. Our adrenals also are going to have a little bit of androgen production, just a little bit. And you're going to see a little bit produced by the placenta itself when it comes to estrogen and progesterone. And obviously we're talking in that case specifically with pregnancy. Now, fun fact, or say more of a random question for you guys. Your average woman, do they have more, if we were to look at the blood values, testosterone, or do they actually have more estrogen inside of their bloodstream? And we'll say, we'll say yes. So your average woman has more estrogen than they have testosterone. So yes or no? Go ahead and hit that up on the polling, guys. Now here's the fascinating thing. If you look at the actual units, your average female has, I believe it's over 10 times, and it's close to 100 times more testosterone than they have estrogen. That's both showing you how little estrogen and progesterone that is required in order to maintain female healthy function, but then also how much testosterone your average female does have. And we'll talk about hormones and health and how that's important in a little bit. But yeah, ladies, you guys technically have more Not technically, you guys literally have more testosterone than you have estrogen. Just turns out estrogen's super effective. So the non-steroid, first major one we have is protein peptides. These are really long, big hormones. It's going to be growth hormone and it's going to be insulin. So these are going to be hormones that are going to bind to a messenger on the outside of the cell, which then is going to cause activation of different cellular pathways through secondary messengers, which in turn is going to obviously upregulate, downregulate appropriately to those tissues, different processes. We then have our amino acid derived. These are literally just individual amino acids that have been modified. Our T3, T4, which is the inactive and inactive, goes active, inactive form of thyroid hormone, along with our epinephrine and norepinephrine from our adrenal glands. Those are going to be examples of just individual amino acids that have been modified. That's why thyroid hormone is triiodidine. It comes from thyroxine, so it'd be probably thyronine. And then epinephrine, that's going to be coming from tyrosine. It's going to be the precursor amino acid. Not that you need to know that. Now, hormones are fascinating in that they're going to come in bursts. So they're going to be produced for a little bit and then stop, produced for a little bit and stop. Now, these are going to naturally fluctuate over the course of a day, and they're obviously going to be fluctuating over weeks and or possibly a month. And so different hormones are going to be released thanks to different different negative feedback loops inside of the body. If we don't have enough of one hormone or another, we're going to produce more of it. And they're also going to be produced due to different stressors that you've put upon the body or stressors that you have not had the body encounter is going to cause the production or decreased production of different hormones. Now, it's important to understand that our releasing of hormones is going to always cause negative feedback. So if we have a high amount, we're going to decrease our secretion. If we have a low amount, we're going to increase our secretion. But this is only looking at the hormone level. This is not also keeping into accord effectively what is happening with the number of receptor. And the receptor is a very key component when it comes to overall hormonal effects on health, wellness, and performance. So thermostat is, think about when the temperature is too low inside of the building, the heater is going to click on until the temperature gets above a certain threshold, and then it's going to click off. And the opposite is going to be true when it gets to be too warm. The AC is going to turn on until the temperature comes down to the correct level that it's been set at, and then it's going to click off. And this is a good thing because we're only producing as much as we need to in order to maintain ourselves within the physiological range that we're looking for. And once again, this is all done via negative feedback. Now, there's a lot going into endocrinology. There's a whole lot going on in endocrinology. My advice to every single one of you guys, no nonsense, is go to a doctor for an annual checkup. When you do so, ask them to run every single hormone that effectively they can on your body. Why? Because right now, guys, you probably have a hormonal level that's never going to get better in your entire life. So your thyroid hormone, your insulin, your fasting blood sugar, your testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, cortisol, all of these hormones are probably going to be as good as they're ever going to be for the rest of your life. You know, ladies, the older you get, eventually you're going to hit menopause and your hormones are going to go right out the window. And from any of you guys that ever been around a woman going through menopause, does not look like a party. Now, on the other side, you know, gentlemen, your testosterone is going to decline as you get older, which, you know, there's nothing necessarily bad about your testosterone going down within certain levels, but having too low of hormones of any specific hormone can cause a number of negative health outcomes, just like having too much. So it's important to try to get your numbers now. And here's why. Because you can have normal levels of certain hormones. However, you can have a very small amount of receptors to these hormones. And so even though your hormones are in the normal range, because you have such a lack of receptors, you are going to be having issues like someone who had a below level number or level of hormones who have a normal level of receptors. meaning you'll have a normal score, but you'll be presenting like someone with a low score. And this is literally due to numbers of receptors. Now, there's certain things we can do to increase the amount of receptors we have on a surface, and this is going to be known as upregulation. And this is where things like exercise is really important for people with type 2 diabetes, which is typically not an issue, especially initially with insulin production. It is an issue with a lack of receptors to that hormone. And because of the lack of receptors for that hormone, you are going to have a greater amount of issues with getting and effectively moving all of that extra blood sugar where it needs to go in the body so it's not glycosylating tissues. So, questions so far? Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is each hormone has a specific receptor for it. Now, the hormone obviously needs to bind in that receptor in order for it to have an effect. And what's more important is understanding that if you don't have the receptors, you don't have an effect. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind is we all have genetic predispositions for it, specifically when it comes to androgens. That's going to be due to CAG repeats on your actual genotype or your genome that literally influences your own natural essentially sensitivity to testosterone. So some folks naturally have a much higher sensitivity and much lower. And one of the more interesting case studies I heard of, one doc was talking about how he had a college football player. Now, normal ranges for testosterone is usually somewhere between like low is 200 and something, which is probably too freaking low because it's 18 to 65-year-old males. And then the upper end of the range is it's like 1100 or a little bit above that. No nonsense. This is a college Division I football player. He had a total testosterone, and this is not using drugs, okay? Total testosterone level, I believe it was it was something absurd. It was like 22 or like 2500. So like nearly twice that of what you'd expect for the high end. Now, wasn't doing drugs. That's just who he was naturally. And, you know, if you've been around enough athletes, you realize that there's some folks that just have some insane gifts, and he was obviously one of them. Now, this athlete suffers severe concussion, had the dysregulation of their hypothalamus, which threw off their pituitary and essentially their hormonal axis. And so whenever he had another blood draw, his testosterone levels came back at 400. Now, this athlete was complaining about fatigue, lack of ability to focus, lack of any type of drive, shall we say, and a number of other issues with his health. And the initial doctor, who this was the doctor for the team, saw his numbers like, well, his testosterone's in the normal range, so he's fine. Now, the doctor giving this case study was this guy's, essentially his family practitioner all the way from when he was a high school athlete into college, and literally had to call up the team doctor and be like, no, this kid is super low testosterone. Look at how high his numbers used to be. And less than a year later, he's less than 1/5 of his previous level of testosterone. And that's thanks to, if we're only looking at the hormone level, we're not getting the information of what's actually going on with your receptor sensitivity and then what is going to be the healthy physiological range. So remind me, guys, whenever we meet on Friday to talk you through the 3 H's that you're looking for with an athlete. I don't want to record me talking about that for class while talking to you guys on the internet. Now, when we're also looking at hormone levels, it's not just total levels, but it's also free levels of the hormone. A lot of your hormones are floating through your bloodstream, bound up to things like albumin, to sex hormone binding globulin, which in turn is actually impeding their physiological effect on your body. So it's the equivalent of saying you've got a lot of the hormone, which you think of it like money, like you've got a lot of money, but it's all bound up, aka it's on a trust fund that you guys can't touch until you're twice your current age. So that amount of hormone is effectively useless to you because it's not actually binding to anything. It's not actually doing the job it's supposed to be doing throughout your body in order to help out your health and performance. So it's not just the amount of hormone and the amount of receptors, but it's also how much of that hormone is essentially free, can be biologically active. It gets complicated, okay? We then have yet another class of hormones, and this is what's known as prostaglandins. Now, these are going to be based or modifications of arachidonic acid, which is a type of fat. And this is going to be important for local signaling. Things like interleukin 6 and otherwise are going to be made from prostaglandins, which are giving us effectively kind of almost like an autocrine effect, or maybe paracrine, where it's going and putting the signaling molecule out for the immediate areas around it. So when we start exercising, we are going to have regulation going on in our body from our anterior pituitary, so the front side of it, our thyroid gland, our adrenals, the top of our kidneys, and then our pancreas. These are going to be released specifically to help us with regulation of how much carbohydrate and fat we're using, so we're not going to run ourselves into issues with effectively burning through all the fuel that we need. Now, the anterior part of the pituitary, okay, is going to be the one that's giving us the hormone release we're looking for the stimulation on our adrenal glands, and along with the stimulation on our thyroid gland and so on. Posterior thyroid is going to release its own hormone that's going to be pretty important that we'll get to later on. Now, our anterior hormones is going to be growth hormone, which is a good one because this is going to be one of the most anabolic hormones you're going to find in the entire human body. It literally causes the anabolism of every single tissue in the human body except for fat. So if you guys were going to go and try to be a pro bodybuilder or whatever, and we injected you with a syringe full of growth hormone, you would not just see an increase in the size of your muscles. You see an increase in size in your bones, in your tendons, in your ligaments, in your intestines, which is sometimes what is referred to as the bubble gut that some athletes can get. I do know that there was a couple athletes from a very well-known strength gym that abused a lot of this in the late 90s, early thousands, and because of that, they literally hypertrophied their large and small intestine to such an extent they actually had to have GI resection. So they actually had to have they had to have solid amounts of their colon removed because it got to be so big it literally developed with some fistulas. Now, the amount you're going to release thanks to exercise is not a lot, and it's going to be related to the intensity of your exercise. So if you're doing a high intensity exercise, you're going to be releasing more growth hormone, which in turn is useful because it's actually helping your tissues recover from the damage that you've done. Now, we're almost out of time for the day. Does anyone have any questions about endocrinology as of right now? Because we're obviously going to be going a lot deeper on Wednesday and then next week. All right, guys. Well, thank you guys for listening. As always, stay safe out there. Remember, you have your lab this week where you're going to be running that 300-yard shuttle and timing your splits on each of those 50-yard increments, and then looking at that essential decreasing of velocity. So in the actual lab form, where it's like the bike power for the first 0 to 5 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, etc., you're just going to be writing your splits in for those times. And then we're going to be talking a little bit of how you can derive power from that. So with that being said, guys, go ahead and yeah, John, you can go ahead and ask your question whenever you're ready, but otherwise you guys have a great day.